At a black-tie charity gala, in front of hundreds of witnesses and 42 million cameras, a billionaire wrapped both hands around his pregnant wife's throat and squeezed. She blacked out on a marble floor. He called his lawyer before the ambulance even arrived. His mother filmed it. And when Tori woke up in that hospital bed, bruised, broken, 8 months pregnant, her husband called and said 4 words she was never supposed to survive. "I own you." He hung up, poured a whiskey, and waited for her to come crawling back. He had no idea. She had just pressed record. What happened next wasn't just a divorce. It wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a woman with $300, a newborn daughter, and a single audio file. Dismantling a $2.3 billion empire piece by piece before her husband even realized the walls were closing in. This is the story of how one quiet tap on a phone screen brought down a man 42 million people already knew was guilty, but couldn't touch. The door was always unlocked. She was her own jailer, and the moment she stopped asking for his permission to save herself was the moment she became free. If this opening already has your heart pounding, stay with us, because the way she built this trap, step by step from a hospital bed, is something you will not see coming. Hit like so this story reaches someone who needs it. And if you're new here, subscribe. We tell stories that change the way you see the world.
The steady beep of a hospital monitor filled the room. Tori's eyes fluttered open. Everything felt wrong, the light too bright, the air tasting of metal, her throat burning as if she'd swallowed glass. "My baby," she whispered, before she knew where she was. "Is my baby okay?" A kind face appeared. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, her obstetrician. "Your daughter is stable, Tori," she said, placing a cold ultrasound wand on her swollen belly. The screen showed a tiny body curled inside. "You, however, have sustained significant trauma." Tori's hand went to her neck, wincing at the touch. The bruising felt raised and tender. She traced its shape again and again, trying to make her mind accept that it was real, that her husband had squeezed her throat until the world went dark. The baby kicked, a strong, insistent thump. Her daughter was alive. They both were. "Mrs. Ashford, there are 2 detectives here," Dr. Hoffman said gently. "Do you feel up to answering some questions?" Tori nodded, the motion sending pain down her spine. A woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a younger man with a notebook entered. The woman pulled a chair close. "Mrs. Ashford, my name is Detective Martinez. This is Detective Brooks. We need to ask you about what happened at the Children's Cancer Gala." The older detective's voice was professional, but not unkind. "Can you tell us what you remember?" "Last night, the gala. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, music." Derek's face twisted with rage, his hands on her throat. "I don't—" She paused, swallowing around the pain. "It happened so fast." "Take your time," Detective Martinez said. But the thought crashed over her. Everyone saw. She had been strangled in front of hundreds of people, in a ballroom full of cameras. There was no denying it. 17 witnesses have already given statements, Detective Brooks added quietly. The venue's security footage captured everything. As tears spilled down her cheeks, the door burst open. Her father, James Caldwell, rushed in, stopping dead when he saw her. His face went white, then red, then a blankness that terrified her. That final, cold expression on her father's face was worse than anger. It was something more final. Baby girl. The words came out broken, a nickname she hadn't heard since before she became Mrs. Ashford. Daddy? Her voice cracked. In front of everyone? I can't. James moved to the bed and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. A lifeline. I am going to fix this. Isem isoanin nissis, he said. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. The detectives exchanged glances and quietly gathered their things. We'll come back later, Detective Martinez said. After they left, only the monitor's beep broke the silence. James held his daughter's hand, staring at the bruises on her throat, his jaw working back and forth. He didn't need to say anything. Another person appeared in the doorway. Rebecca Morrison, Tori's best friend, stood holding a tablet, her mascara smudged. Tori, Becca's voice trembled. I am so sorry. I didn't want to show you this, but it's everywhere. She reluctantly held out the tablet. It was posted 4 hours ago. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Everyone is sharing it. Tori took it with shaking hands. The security footage was already playing, crystal clear in black and white. She saw herself first, one hand on her pregnant belly. Then Derek followed, his face a mask of rage. She watched herself turn to face him on the screen, his hands reaching for her neck, his fingers wrapping around and squeezing. Her eyes went wide. Her mouth opened with no sound. On the screen, she was pressing against Derek, trying to push him away as he squeezed harder. Her hands clawed at his wrists, her knees starting to buckle. 2 waiters ran into the frame, pulling Derek backward. He released her, his face showing only fury, no remorse. The video ended. Below it, a number glowed red. 42 million views. Tori dropped the tablet. There's more, Becca said quietly. His lawyers gave a statement. She swiped to a news article. Derek's attorney stood on their mansion steps. Mr. Ashford deeply regrets the altercation, the lawyer read. His wife has been experiencing severe pregnancy-related emotional instability. Then, it cut to Derek's mother, dabbing at dry eyes. Tori has been very difficult. We have all been worried about her mental state. They were already spinning the narrative, making her the unstable villain. Her phone began to ring on the bedside table. Private number. James reached for it, but Tori picked it up. She pressed answer. Come home, Victoria. Derek's voice was calm, the voice that fooled everyone. We will forget this happened. Tori's hand moved to her throat, touching the real, undeniable bruises. No, she whispered. His tone sharpened. What did you say? I said no. A short, cold laugh cracked through the phone. You do not get to say no to me, Victoria. I own you. I own that baby. You will come home, or I will make sure you lose everything. The line went dead. Tori lowered the phone slowly, looking at her father and her best friend. Ah, so that's how it was. She had been living in a prison with an unlocked door all along. With matching expressions of worry and barely suppressed rage, both men watched her. I'm not going back, Tori declared, her voice firmer and clearer than before. Something inside her had shifted when Derek uttered those words, I own you. Something shattered, and in its place, a new resolve grew. I am never going back. James reached over, placing a gentle kiss on his daughter's forehead. You won't have to. I promise you that. Later, after Becca went for coffee and James stepped out to make some calls, Tori found herself alone for the first time since she woke up. She picked up her phone, stared at it, then opened the App Store. She found an application for recording calls, downloaded it, and ran a quick test to ensure it worked. She didn't tell a soul. She didn't ask for permission or wait for her father or her lawyer to suggest it. She just did it, quietly, systematically. She knew Derek would call again. He always did. He had to have the last word, had to remind her who was in charge. But next time, she would be ready. Next time, his own words would be the very weapon she turned against him. Tori laid the phone on the nightstand, resting both hands on her stomach, as she felt her daughter kick. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "I'm not sure how just yet, but we will be." The heart monitor beeped a steady rhythm. Outside, the rain that had been looming all morning finally started to fall, tapping softly on the hospital window. Miles away, in a penthouse suite that cost more than most people earn in 10 lifetimes, Derek Ashford was pouring a whiskey and phoning his legal team, completely certain his wife would soon come crawling back. He had no clue what was about to hit him. This was 6 hours after the ambulance ride. 6 hours after the security camera footage went viral. 6 hours after 42 million people saw her husband try to end her life. Tori had been standing in her walk-in closet, debating what to put on. The Children's Cancer Gala was a major event on the city's social calendar. She had planned her attendance for months, back when she still paid attention to such things, back when she still felt like herself. "Are you ready?" Derek's voice echoed from the bedroom. "We're going to be late." Tori reached for a navy blue maternity dress. It featured long sleeves and a conservative neckline, a safe, appropriate, and comfortable choice for a woman who was 8 months along with a perpetually aching back, swollen ankles, and weeks of sleepless nights. Derek materialized in the closet doorway. His tuxedo was already on, custom-fitted by a tailor whose fee for one suit exceeded what most families pay in a year's rent. He glanced at the dress she was holding, and his jaw clenched. "That thing makes you look huge," he stated. "Change. I'm 8 months pregnant, Derek. I am huge." His eyes narrowed, and the warmth in the room seemed to vanish. "Don't be difficult. Find something else." With hands that had begun to tremble, Tori returned the navy dress to the rack. She recognized this mood, the tension around his eyes, the clipped tone, the locked jaw. They were all warning signs she had learned to interpret over 3 years of marriage. A private language of impending danger. She took out a black gown, too formal, a burgundy one, too showy, a gray one, too plain. "For God's sake, Victoria," Derek snapped, stepping into the closet. His cologne, sharp and expensive, felt suffocating. "It's not that hard. Just pick a dress." Tori flinched at the sound of his voice. She grabbed a champagne-colored gown and held it up for his inspection. It was sophisticated and subtle, the type of dress that would look good in photos without demanding all the attention. Derek stared at it for a beat before giving a single, sharp nod. "Better. Now hurry." He turned and left. With unsteady hands, Tori changed into the champagne dress. It took her 3 attempts to work the zipper over her pregnant stomach. When she glanced in the mirror, she hardly knew the woman looking back at her, the hollow eyes, the forced smile. It was a stranger wearing her face. She used to be somebody. She used to be Victoria Caldwell, the director of a non-profit helping underprivileged youth get an education. She used to run marathons with 3 under her belt and training for a 4th when she met Derek at a benefit. He was so charming that night, so magnetic, the kind of man who made you feel like the center of the universe. She should have realized his charm was the bait. It always was. The ride to the gala was silent. Derek's driver navigated the evening traffic while Derek scrolled through his phone. Tori just watched the city lights smear past the tinted windows. She felt her daughter kick, a strong, insistent, living presence, and she placed a hand over her belly. I'm so sorry, she thought. I'm so sorry I picked him. The car came to a stop at the hotel entrance. A wall of photographers, 3 rows deep, flanked the red carpet. Camera flashes erupted like a lightning storm as the car door opened. Derek's hand closed on Tori's elbow as they emerged. To any observer, the gesture appeared supportive, the devoted husband assisting his pregnant wife. Only Tori felt his fingers press into her arm, hard enough to leave bruises through the fabric. "Smile," he hissed through a clenched jaw. "Look happy." Tori smiled. The cameras ate it up. Mrs. Derek Ashford, pregnant and radiant, the ideal billionaire's wife. By tomorrow, these images would be splashed across society columns, celebrity gossip sites, and Instagram feeds all over the nation. The perfect couple, living a fairy tale. No one ever took pictures of what happened when the doors were closed. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers bathed hundreds of guests in a warm glow. Women wore designer gowns that cost more than cars, and men in bespoke tuxedos sipped champagne that cost more per glass than a family's weekly groceries. Anyone in the city was there. Margaret Ashford, Derek's mother, emerged from the crowd. She was draped in white silk and diamonds, her hair impeccably coiffed, her posture stiff, and her smile as polished as a politician's. She air-kissed Tori's cheeks, never making actual contact. "Darling, you look—" Margaret paused, her eyes sweeping over Tori, taking inventory of every perceived imperfection. Glowing, the word hung between them like a threat. What Margaret actually meant was entirely different. "You're fat, you're an embarrassment, you're not good enough for my son, you're not good enough for this family." "Thank you, Margaret," Tori replied softly. She had learned long ago that any other response would be twisted and used against her. Derek's hand remained clamped on her elbow, guiding her through the throngs, dictating where she went, who she spoke to, and how long she lingered. At this party, she wasn't a person. She was a prop, an accessory to be shown off and controlled. Then, Tori spotted a familiar face across the room, and her own face lit up with genuine warmth for the first time all night. It was Marcus Webb, an investigative reporter she had worked with years ago. That was back when she had her own nonprofit, her own career, her own life, back when she was still Victoria Caldwell. "Marcus," she called out, waving before she could second-guess herself. He made his way toward her, a warm smile on his face. He was in his late 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice and remember everything. "Tori, it's been ages. How are you?" "I'm great, really great." She felt Derek's grip tighten on her arm, but chose to ignore it. For just a second, she wanted to feel like herself again. "How's the world of journalism?" "Busy. I'm on a piece about corporate accountability at the moment. Some really interesting stuff." Marcus motioned toward her stomach. "When's the due date?" "6 weeks. It's a girl." "Congratulations. Think you'll go back to the non-profit world after she arrives?" Tori's eyes brightened. It was the first time in months anyone had asked about her plans, her future, not just about the baby, the marriage, or Derek's latest venture. Someone was asking what Victoria Caldwell wanted. "Maybe I've been thinking about it. There's so much to be done in youth education, and I really miss— my wife is getting tired." Derek materialized beside her like a phantom. His smile was strained, controlled, the one he used when he was enraged but couldn't show it in public. "Pregnancy brain, you know. She doesn't know what she's saying." "Actually, I was just—" Tori began, but Derek's hand shifted from her elbow to her upper arm. His fingers dug into the muscle, hard enough to leave marks, hard enough to make her gasp, though she did so quietly enough that only he could hear. "Excuse us, Marcus." Good seeing you. He steered Tori away from the conversation. She nearly lost her balance, her center of gravity already compromised by her pregnancy. Derek didn't ease up. I need the restroom, Tori said, once they were out of Marcus's earshot. Fine, don't be long. She navigated through the crowd toward a hallway leading to the bathrooms. The din of the gala receded behind her heels echoing on the marble floor. It was quieter here, cooler, the party's noise muffled by the thick wall. She slipped into the women's restroom and locked herself inside a stall. Her hands were trembling again as she took deep, shaky breaths, trying to quiet her pounding heart. With flashing phone cameras documenting every second, Derek was finally restrained, 3 men struggling to contain his wild fury. He wasn't ashamed, he was enraged at being caught. Through her tears, Tori looked up from the floor and saw Margaret Ashford on the edge of the crowd. Derek's mother stood there, phone held high, recording the entire scene, not helping, not stopping her son, just filming the wreckage of their lives. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Margaret's expression was a cold, empty void, the face of a woman who had long ago learned to just watch the violence unfold. Then, Margaret slowly lowered her phone, and Tori's world faded to black. The baby inside her gave a frantic kick, a tiny silent scream against the chaos. In the background, someone was on the phone, their voice urgent. Yes, we need an ambulance. This public humiliation was the price for what happened only moments before. Derek's hand had shot out, slamming Tori against the cold marble wall. The impact stole the air from her lungs. His fingers wrapped around her throat, instantly applying full, crushing force. She couldn't breathe, her hands clawing uselessly at his wrists. As she scrambled for footing on the slick floor, the baby kicked wildly, a desperate, internal alarm. Derek's face was inches from hers, his breath a toxic mix of whiskey and pure hatred. You are nothing without me, he seethed, her vision blurred, gray spots blooming at the edges. As her knees gave out, his grip was the only thing holding her up, pinned and dying in a hallway, the last thing she would ever see being the rage in his eyes. Just before she lost consciousness, she heard running footsteps and a man's voice yelling, "Hey, stop! Someone call 911. She woke up to the steady beeping of a hospital monitor, the morning light painting the room a soft gold. A deep, bruised ache pulsed in her throat with every heartbeat. Beside her bed sat her father, his shirt wrinkled and his face etched with worry. He looked 10 years older. "Dad?" she whispered. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "How are you feeling?" "Like a truck hit me," she managed, the small attempt at a smile sending a fresh wave of pain. After a slow sip of water, her father told her the police wanted another statement, but he had put them off. She set the cup down, her hands surprisingly steady. The secret she had carried for 3 years had finally broken free, and with its release came a strange, unexpected calm. She had been rehearsing this conversation in the dark, waking hours of the night. It was time. "Dad," she said, her voice clear, "I need to tell you something." He went completely still. This wasn't the first time. "What do you mean?" her father asked, his voice coiled tight, holding back an ocean of rage. And so, Tori began to unravel the past, the words flowing faster as the dam of secrets finally broke. "6 months after we got married," she started, "I asked him to come to my nonprofit's annual gala. I had planned it for months. He said he was too busy." She paused, reliving the moment. "When I told him it was important to me, he threw his phone at the wall. It shattered everywhere." She closed her eyes. He just looked at the glass and said, "Look what you made me do." Her father's controlled voice cut through the memory. "What did you do?" "I cleaned it up," she confessed. I apologized. I told myself he was just under a lot of pressure. She took a shaky breath. 3 months after that, I wanted to visit you for Christmas. He insisted we spend it with his mother. The gentle tapping of rain against the window accompanied the next memory. I suggested we split the holidays, Tori continued, her eyes still closed. Christmas Eve with Margaret, Christmas Day with you. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. He punched a hole in the wall, right next to my head, another 6 inches, and he would have hit me. Year 2 was worse. The things he threw started getting closer. A glass that shattered by my feet, a plate that smashed on the counter next to my hand. It was never a direct hit, but the threat was always there, and it was always my fault. Always says, "Look what you made me do." Her father's voice was strained. "Did you tell anyone?" "I told Becca once," Tori admitted. "She told me to leave. I got angry with her, defended him. I said she didn't understand the pressure he was under. She finally opened her eyes and met her father's gaze. I didn't speak to Becca for 3 months after that. Derek was so happy. He said she was a bad influence, that she was just jealous and trying to ruin our marriage." Her father stood abruptly, turning to stare out at the rain, his shoulders trembling with suppressed emotion. "What happened in year 3? He asked, his back still to her. "He twisted my wrist during a fight," she said, her voice flat. "Bent it back until I heard a pop. He claimed it was an accident, that he didn't realize his own strength. I wore a brace for 2 weeks and told everyone, even my doctor, that I'd slipped on the stairs." Tori placed a hand on her stomach. "That was when I found out I was pregnant." Her father's voice was a soft, heartbroken whisper. "And you thought a baby would fix it." "I thought it might calm him down," she said, a bitter laugh catching in her raw throat. "I thought it would give him something else to focus on besides his work and me. Everything I kept doing wrong." She looked at her father, a desperate need for him to understand welling up inside her. "I know that was stupid, Dad. Believe me, I knew how stupid I was being while I was doing it. Does that make any sense?" "Yes," he said quietly, turning back from the window. "It makes perfect sense." And with that, the floodgates opened. The words poured out of her, a confession of every excuse she had ever made for him, for every shattered object, for every hole punched in a wall, for every time his grip was too tight or his words cut too deep. It all started so quietly, a single crack in the foundation of their lives. She was just a young woman in love, planning a charity event, thrilled about her life and her future husband. All she did was walk into their living room one evening, a binder full of seating charts in her arms, a hopeful smile on her face. She was excited to ask her fiancé, Derek, a simple question about attending her first big fundraiser. And that's when he looked at her, his face a mask of irritation, and said he was too busy to be bothered with her little charity project. That's how it all began. With the judge's gavel strike, it was over. News alerts lit up every phone in the courtroom. Ashford Innovations CEO indicted. Stock plummets. From the safety of her father's guest house, Tori watched the empire crumble on live television, her newborn daughter sleeping soundly in her arms. The victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the quiet peace that followed. It was a victory built on a promise, paid for with courage, and executed with cold, calculating precision. But this moment of justice was merely the end of a story that had begun 4 weeks earlier in a sterile, silent hospital room. The world saw a corporate titan fall. Only a handful of people knew the intricate, desperate plan that had brought him down. The whole affair started with a quiet confession, a story of pain whispered between a father and daughter. The final blow came from two people who had every reason to stay silent. Gregory Whitman, Derek's business manager of 10 years, walked into court flanked by federal marshals, handing over encrypted hard drives that detailed years of corporate fraud. His testimony, protected by his family's new 24-hour security detail funded by an anonymous benefactor, was devastating. Simultaneously, a journalist named Marcus Webb published a verified 6-month investigation, led by an interview with Jennifer Torres. She was a woman who had disappeared 5 years prior, her silence bought for $500,000 and a broken wrist. Seeing the video of a pregnant Tory being assaulted, she finally broke her non-disclosure agreement, her voice giving a name and a history to Derek's brutality. It was their courage that provided the bulletproof evidence the team needed. But getting them to speak had almost been impossible. Derek was a master of intimidation. After Gregory Whitman's daughter was followed home from school a second time, he had backed out, terrified. It took a personal visit from James Caldwell, who sat in Gregory's living room and laid out an ironclad protection plan and a financial future free from fear, to change his mind. James's reach was long, his resources seemingly limitless. He fought Derek's shadowy threats with overwhelming force, not just for his daughter, but for every person who dared to help her. While Derek used fear to isolate, James used his immense power to build a fortress around his allies, proving that the cost of surrender was far higher than the cost of resistance. Derek's counterattack had been swift and merciless, a professional operation designed to crush Tori's spirit. Within 48 hours, fabricated medical records painting her as mentally unstable flooded gossip sites. A paid psychologist speculated on national television about her postpartum psychosis risk. The hashtag Gold Digger trended globally as a coordinated bot network painted her as a manipulative schemer. He froze every joint account, leaving her with only $300 to her name. A surveillance photo of her was leaving her doctor's office arrived on her phone with a chilling message: "We are watching you." The final, cruelest move was a cease and desist letter sent to her doctor, threatening a career-ending lawsuit and suggesting Tori's injuries were self-inflicted, a move meant to silence her most credible medical witness. The strategy to dismantle Derek was born in a war room that had, just hours before, been a quiet guest house. James Caldwell had assembled a team of specialists. Diane Sullivan, his chief investment officer for 15 years, was the first to arrive. She dissected Derek's $2.3 billion empire, identifying the critical vulnerability: his publicly traded company. Marcus Webb, the journalist, brought 6 months of research on Derek's corporate crimes and the name of a past victim. And finally, Catherine Mills, a divorce attorney known as the Executioner, laid out their unforgiving timeline. She secured a sympathetic judge, but warned them that they needed undeniable proof, and they had only 4 weeks before Tori's baby was due. That was all the time they had to act before Derek could legally claim rights to the child. Before the war room, before the lawyers and investigators, there was only a father sitting beside his daughter's hospital bed. For the first time, James saw the truth. For 3 years, he had missed every sign: the long sleeves in the summer heat, the way she would subtly flinch at her husband's touch, the endless canceled lunches. He had been so immersed in his own world, he hadn't noticed his daughter was living in a war zone. As the rain beat against the window, he closed his eyes, the shame of his ignorance turning into something cold and absolute. Taking her hand, he made a promise, his voice the calm, steady tone of a man who understood power. "I am going to take everything from him," he said. He had $800 million and 3 decades of connections. He was going to fix this. And all of it, the entire downfall of a billionaire, began with a whispered confession. "Family pressure," Tori had said, her voice thin. "My fault for not being good enough." She explained how the pregnancy had made it worse, how Derek hated her changing body, her exhaustion, her inability to play the part of the perfect corporate wife. He called her an embarrassment, said she was letting herself go. When asked if he had ever hit her before that night, she admitted it wasn't with a closed fist, but with shoves and brutal grips that left bruises she had to hide with makeup and long sleeves. She finally broke down, her voice a bare whisper, admitting that last month he had slammed her into the kitchen counter so hard she couldn't breathe. She told her doctor she had tripped over the cat. "We don't even have a cat," she whispered to her father. James turned from the window, tears streaming down his face, but his expression wasn't one of sadness. It was the look of cold, hard certainty. "I should have seen it," he said, his voice thick with regret. Tori explained how completely Derek had isolated her, manufacturing business trips and family visits every single time she tried to see her father. It was a calculated campaign of control that had gone on for 3 years, a quiet, hidden war she had been fighting all alone. It was in that moment, seeing the full scope of his daughter's secret torment, that a father's love turned into a promise of absolute retribution. The clock on the wall was finally silent, its countdown over. At 2 in the morning, Tori picked up her phone. "Dad, can I sleep in the main house tonight? I don't want to be alone anymore." "Of course," he'd said, his voice thick with relief. She walked the familiar path between the two houses. The night air, crisp and cold under a sky full of stars. The distant city hummed, a dog barked, the wind rustled the trees, all normal sounds. But for the first time in a month, Tori didn't feel eyes on her back. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, was finally gone. Justice had been served. That justice had a price, paid by a woman 2 states away. Marcus Webb had to go back a second time. He didn't bring arguments, he brought 8x10 glossy photos from the gala footage. He showed them to Jennifer Torres, a woman who had built a new life from the wreckage Derek left behind. She saw Tori's pregnant belly. She saw Derek's hands wrapped around her throat. "He did the same thing to me," she whispered, her voice trembling as she remembered the choking. "I thought I was going to die." She sat on her front steps, her dog pressing close. "I'll break the NDA. I don't care about the money. I want you to print my real name. I'm done hiding from him." Another ally worked in silence. In her office, Tori's doctor looked over the file that chronicled 3 years of injuries. There were the photos Tori had let her take, the clinical descriptions of bruises that never matched the flimsy explanations, and notes about the way Tori's heart would race with a vigilance that had nothing to do with medical checkups. Her hand shook just a little as she picked up her pen and signed the release. The next day, Tori's complete medical history, every photograph, every note, every documented instance of violence, including the bruising from a strangulation that nearly killed her during labor, was on its way to the court. This secret war was waged against a very public one. With only 12 days left on the clock, Derek's lawyers moved for prenatal custody, claiming Tori was an unfit mother before the baby was even born. They had evaluations from 3 psychiatrists who'd never even met her, diagnosing her with personality disorders based on Derek's lies. At the same time, Derek stood at a podium, cameras flashing, and announced a huge donation to a children's cancer charity, tears in his eyes. "In light of recent personal difficulties," he said, looking heartbroken, "I want to move forward with grace." He called her his wife, as if he hadn't just tried to murder her. While he played the saint, she lived in a cage built by her father's gate. She stopped leaving The property. There was no safe place to go. News vans were a permanent fixture, with 20 or 30 reporters yelling questions whenever the gate opened. Paparazzi hid in the bushes, their telephoto lenses pointed at her windows. Protesters carried signs calling Derek innocent and her a gold digger. Someone left a dead rat on the porch, its body stiff. A note tied to its tail, reading gold digger. Her father found it, his hand shaking as he threw it away before she could see. Tori retreated into the nursery. Silent tears traced paths down her face in the moonlight. "I used to be someone, baby girl," she whispered to her unborn child. "I was Victoria Caldwell. I ran nonprofits. I helped people. I was smart and capable and strong." A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. Her mother, in a hospital room much like the one she'd woken up in. Skin like paper over bone, cancer having taken everything but her fierce eyes. "Promise me something," her mother had said, her hand frail and almost translucent. "Never let anyone make you small. The world will try. Men will try. They will want you to shrink to make them comfortable. Do not do it. Take up space. Use your voice. Be big and loud." "I promise, Mom," she'd said. But she had broken that promise. She had let Derek make her small. She remembered him telling her that her opinions made her sound stupid, that she embarrassed him. So she stopped having opinions. She just agreed. She became Mrs. Derek Ashford and forgot how to be Victoria. And now, looking at her reflection in the window, she could see just how much of herself had disappeared. Her eyes were tired, the bruises on her throat were fading, and her pregnant belly seemed impossibly large. She stood up from the rocking chair, her mind replaying the conversation. She had shrunk herself down until almost nothing was left, but she was still here, still standing, still breathing. "I broke my promise," she whispered to her mother's memory, "but I can fix it. I can be big again, for both of us." The clock on the wall read 22 days. It was 4 in the morning, the baby shifting inside her, and an idea was forming, something Diane had mentioned in passing. Gregory Whitman had let slip that Derek had a mistress, a model, paid for with company money. It was something nobody would expect her to pursue, a path she would walk entirely on her own. She picked up her phone. She searched Derek's public Instagram first. It was perfectly curated. Charity events, conferences, a gleaming office. Nothing. Then she remembered the second phone, the one he kept in the safe and checked late at night. The phone she knew better than to ask about. Just then, her own phone buzzed. An unknown number. Her heart hammered as she answered. An older woman's voice, shaking with fear, whispered, "Check his second account. The username has DA and numbers." And then the line went dead. The voice was strangely familiar, like someone she'd heard on TV or across a crowded room. She started searching. DA 2019, DA private, DA 8834. Then she found it. A private account with just 3 followers. One of them was a model named Amber Collins. A quick look at Amber's public page confirmed everything. The 26-year-old model lived in a luxury downtown apartment, her posts filled with expensive gifts, designer bags, trips to Aspen, all on Derek's dime, company money. Tori knew she had to act alone, without telling her father, Catherine, or Becca. She sent Amber a direct message. "My name is Victoria Ashford. I am Derek's wife. I am not angry at you. I need to talk. It is about your safety." 2 agonizing days later, a one-word reply appeared. "Where?" They met at a remote cafe, Tori feeling ridiculous in a baseball cap and sunglasses like a spy in a bad movie, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of agency. She was done waiting to be saved. Amber was already there, defensive and wary. "You're just a jealous wife trying to ruin his life," she said, before Tori could even sit. Tori said nothing. She simply placed her phone on the table between them and played the video from the gala. Amber watched in silence as Derek's hands closed around Tori's pregnant throat, watched her struggle and go limp before being pull off. When the video ended, Tori spoke quietly. "He did this to me. He will do it to you." She asked the questions she already knew the answers to. "Has he checked your phone yet? Told you which friends are bad influences? Has he said, 'Look what you made me do'?" A flicker of fear and recognition crossed Amber's face. Without a word, she stood up and walked out, leaving Tori alone with her tea and the kicking baby inside her. She hadn't made a mistake. 2 weeks later, when Derek's control tightened, monitoring Amber's phone, questioning her friends, calling her career a joke, Amber called Tori. She had everything: financial records, receipts for the apartment, credit card statements, wire transfers. It was the evidence Gregory had been too afraid to provide. While this was happening, James and Diane were cornering Gregory at a diner 60 miles from the city. He was a wreck, terrified after someone followed his daughter from school. "They threatened my girls," he stammered. "A black car just sat there for 2 hours." James immediately promised to provide 24/7 private security for his family. "Derek follows through," Gregory warned. But Diane slid a folder across the table. "So do I," she said. She explained that the SEC was already looking into Ashford Innovations, that the offshore accounts he managed would be found with or without him. "Your name is on those documents, Gregory. You can cooperate now and negotiate immunity, or you can go to prison with him." His face went white. 3 days later, in a parking garage, a still shaking Gregory handed James a USB drive. $200 million in embezzlement, Gregory said, his eyes red. Offshore accounts, wire transfers, emails where Derek talks about hiding money. It's all there. He couldn't look at his daughters anymore, knowing he was helping a monster. With that evidence secured, the clock read 18 days. Catherine Mills filed a subpoena for Tori's complete medical records from Dr. Hoffman. Derek's lawyers retaliated with a cease and desist letter, threatening to destroy the doctor's career. But a court subpoena held legal authority. Dr. Hoffman knew complying would cost her hundreds of thousands in legal fees and risk her license. But sitting alone in her office, she chose to face them. She would comply. There, Becca found her one afternoon, sitting on the floor surrounded by mountains of baby socks. Tori was trying to sort 2 nearly identical white pairs, one with pink trim, the other with pink polka dots. "What are you doing?" Becca asked, her face a mask of concern. "Organizing," Tori answered, holding up the socks. "They shouldn't be mixed together." Becca gently took them from her hands. "You've been sorting these for 2 hours. Talk to me." Tori's voice cracked. "I just need to have control over something, because I can't control anything else." And then the dam broke. The ugly, soul-deep crying she'd held back for weeks finally came pouring out. "The news says I'm crazy. His lawyers want my baby. His mother calls me a liar on TV every day," she sobbed into her best friend's shoulder. "I can't stop organizing these stupid socks." Becca just held her tighter. "It's okay not to be fine," she said. Being strong doesn't mean not breaking down. It means breaking down and then getting back up. Let yourself fall apart for a minute. I've got you. She cried for the husband she thought she had, the future that was now just a ghost. Before all that, in the quiet dark of the nursery, she spoke to her unborn daughter. "I used to run marathons before I met your father," she whispered, folding and unfolding a tiny onesie. I was training for my fourth when I met him. He was so charming. She paused. He said marathons were a waste of time, that I should focus on things that mattered to our future. She set down the onesie and picked up impossibly small socks. So I stopped. I gave away my running shoes. I canceled my registrations. I told myself it was a sacrifice you make for love. With a big, fearless smile, Charlotte let go of the coffee table. She wobbled for a moment, then took her very first step toward her mother. Victoria Caldwell, she'd dropped the Ashford name the day the divorce was final, watched her daughter, a child who would never be made to feel small. This freedom, however, had come at an immense price. James Caldwell, Victoria's father, had liquidated his entire $800 million fortune, every cent he'd earned over 30 years, to dismantle the man who had nearly killed his daughter. When asked if the cost was worth it, his answer was always the same: that money was always hers. While Victoria and Charlotte started their new life, Derek Ashford began his own, 25 years behind concrete walls, with no company, no family, and only the stinging knowledge that his daughter would grow up in a home that wasn't his. His downfall was sealed in Judge Brennan's courtroom. The proceedings had been a methodical presentation of irrefutable truth. Catherine, Victoria's lawyer, began with 3 years of Dr. Hoffman's medical records, which documented a chilling pattern of injuries, complete with clinical photos of bruises. Next came the witness statements from 17 gala attendees, all describing Derek's violent assault. This was followed by the gala's security footage, played on a large screen in deafening silence, showing Derek's hands closing around a pregnant Victoria's throat. Then, Gregory Whitman testified, laying bare the financial fraud with bank statements and emails that detailed the theft of $200 million. Jennifer Torres bravely took the stand, recounting the story of her broken wrist and the non-disclosure agreement she was forced to sign. But the final devastating blow was a recording. Derek's own voice echoed through the silent courtroom, spitting threats against Victoria's father, her lawyer, a reporter, and even Gregory's young children by name. That recording was Victoria's masterstroke. A desperate gambit, born in the dead of night when everyone else was asleep. She had picked up her phone, her hands shaking, and dialed Derek's number. He answered almost immediately, his voice dripping with the false charm that had fooled so many. "Victoria," he'd said, "I'm glad you called. All I want is for our family to be together again." But Victoria was ready. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times, knowing his ego was his greatest weakness. "If I come back," she asked, her voice steady, "what happens to the people who helped me?" That was all it took. The mask slipped. He promised to bury her father, ruin Catherine Mills, and destroy Marcus Webb. He called Gregory a dead man walking, then named his daughters and their elementary school. Victoria, her voice a perfect mask of control, simply said, "I'll think about it," and hung up. She immediately saved the file and sent it to Catherine with a simple message. "He threatened everyone. It's all on recording." The ground had been prepared just 10 days earlier. At 9 in the evening, an article by Marcus Webb went live on a major national news site. The headline was explosive: "The Real Derek Ashford, a pattern of violence, abuse, and financial crime." The 12,000-word piece was the result of a 6-month investigation. It featured 4 ex-girlfriends describing the same pattern of charm, isolation, and escalating violence. Jennifer Torres was quoted at length about her broken wrist and the $500,000 check that came with the NDA. "I was terrified," she said, "but I can't live with what happened to others after me." The story was a firestorm, laying bare the truth long before the trial began. The article also detailed years of workplace abuse, including a story about a laptop thrown at an intern's head and a female assistant who quit and filed for disability due to post-traumatic stress. Gregory's evidence of financial crimes was laid out for the world to see. Offshore accounts, wire transfers, and falsified reports. Stills from the gala security footage were included, showing Derek's hands around Victoria's throat, her pregnant belly in full view. Gregory was quoted saying, "I watched him become a monster. I was afraid, but I'm not afraid anymore." The public response was immediate and overwhelming. In just 1 hour, the article was shared 10,000 times. Within 3 hours, 2 more women had come forward with their own stories. By midnight, Ashford Innovations' stock had plummeted by 15%. The fallout proved that the narrative was no longer his to control. Derek left a furious voicemail on Victoria's phone, filled with threats to sue the reporter and take their daughter away forever. She saved it. Every word he spoke was just more evidence. Another nail in the coffin. He was too arrogant to see he was building for himself. And it all started in a moment of utter despair. Comments were flooding social media, attacking Victoria and defending Derek. "He seems so genuine," one read. "She probably provoked him." In an emergency meeting, her team was frantic. "He's not just fighting custody," Catherine said. "He's rewriting reality. We need to file tonight." The despair was a physical weight, keeping Victoria awake at night. The thought of facing him in court, of describing 3 years of abuse while he sat just 10 feet away, was unbearable. 7 months later, Tori watched her daughter Charlotte grab a fistful of dandelions in the park, babbling at the birds. The pure, free sound of Charlotte's laugh was everything that mattered. A text message lit up her phone. It was from her lawyer, Catherine. The words glowed on the screen. "Sentencing, upheld on appeal. 25 years confirmed. It's really over." Tori put the phone away, a weight she hadn't even realized was still there, finally lifting from her shoulders. She pushed the swing, and her daughter laughed again. At home that night, after Charlotte was asleep, Tori recorded a voice memo, a story for her daughter to hear someday. 500 miles away, Derek Ashford stared at the concrete wall of his 6-by-8-foot cell. The company, the homes, the cars, the name on the side of a building, all gone. A 25-year sentence stretched before him, a blur of fluorescent lights and silence. The only image that remained was from the supervised visitation. Charlotte, his 4-month-old daughter, on Tori's lap, reaching for a toy, not even looking at the stranger across the table. By the time he got out, she would be a woman who knew exactly what he had done. He would be nothing to her, and he had no one to blame but himself. It was all because of the words that had echoed in the courtroom months earlier. Judge Brennan had looked directly at Derek, her voice cutting through the silence. "Mr. Ashford, I find your defense to be insulting to this court's intelligence. You attempted to murder your wife in front of hundreds of witnesses. You then used your wealth and influence to launch a smear campaign against the victim." The judge listed his actions: fabricating records, paying people to lie, and continuing to lie in her courtroom. Before turning her attention to Tori, "Mrs. Ashford, I am granting your petition in full." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Tori would have sole legal and physical custody of her daughter. Derek was granted only 1 supervised hour of visitation per month in a secure facility. An emergency protective order was issued. He was to stay 500 feet away from her at all times. Furthermore, the judge declared, her eyes fixed on Derek, "I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. What you did to your wife was attempted murder. You should be in jail." Tori collapsed into Catherine's arms, sobbing with a relief so profound it shook her entire body. It was over. Charlotte was safe. "With every choice you made, You built this outcome for yourself. Your father used $800 million to try and destroy me, while my father spent $800 million to keep me safe, to keep Charlotte safe. That's the shape of real love, something you know nothing about. You mistake love for control, for ownership, but it's about sacrifice and protection. It's putting someone else's life ahead of your own. Tori adjusted Charlotte in her lap, the little girl grabbing for a toy, completely unaware of the man across the table. By the time you're released from prison, Charlotte will be grown. She'll understand exactly who you are and what you did, and she'll decide for herself if she wants you in her life. It will be her choice, not mine or yours. Derek shot up from his seat, the chair screeching on the floor. Linda moved in, and the guards tensed. "I can't do this," he muttered, turning and walking away. The door clicked shut behind him. Tori stepped out of the building into the bright afternoon, where Becca was waiting. "How do you feel?" she asked. Tori considered it. And so, 3 days later, Gregory Whitman woke up in his hospital room, 2 floors beneath Tori's. The first words he spoke to the officer by his bed were the start of unraveling everything. In the courtroom, the silence had been absolute for a long, heavy moment. The judge glanced at Derek's empty chair, then back at Tori's image on the screen. Her broken body, her unbreakable spirit. "Motion denied," he declared. Full custody remains with Victoria Ashford. This victory was born from her refusal to stay silent, even from an ICU bed. "Your Honor," she had said, her voice steady despite the pain. "3 days ago, I almost died bringing my daughter into this world. The complications came from injuries my husband gave me when he strangled me at 8 months pregnant. I speak to you from a hospital bed. I haven't held my child yet, but I am here because that's what mothers do. My husband isn't. He sends lawyers. He always sends others to do what he won't. That's how we're different. I show up even when it's painful, even when I'm terrified, even when my body is failing me. I show up because my daughter needs me to, and I will never stop showing up for her." She had stared at her father for a long while, this woman in a hospital gown who could barely prop herself up. "Your mother would have been so proud of you," he'd finally said. The night before the hearing, her father, James, had come to her room and closed the door. "I have information," he'd said. "This new judge is financially tied to one of Derek's investors. We can expose it, get him thrown off the case." Tori had looked from her father to the bassinet where Charlotte slept. "No," she'd told him. "Tori, that's Derek's game, using connections to bend the system. If we do it, we're just like him. It's not about being better. It's about winning," he'd insisted. "It's about both, Dad. One day, Charlotte will ask how I fought for her. I need to look her in the eye and tell her I did it the right way, that I didn't become the monster I was fighting against." "Can you sign papers?" Catherine had asked, her voice a steady, fierce anchor. "I can barely hold a pen," Tori had answered. "Then we'll figure it out. We have 24 hours, and we're going to use every last minute." Catherine had filed the emergency response right from Tori's hospital room, typing on a laptop as Tori dictated through waves of agony. Their core argument was brutally simple. Mr. Ashford strangled his wife, causing cervical bruising that led to delivery complications. He is now weaponizing those very complications, which he himself caused, to argue she is unfit. This court should not allow an abuser to benefit from the damage he inflicted. The judge, a different one, wanted to hear from them directly, scheduling an emergency hearing for the next morning. Catherine requested Tori be allowed to appear via video from the ICU, and the judge agreed. The news came on the 3rd day, a second catastrophe delivered by her grim-faced lawyer, Catherine Mills. "Derek's attorneys filed an emergency motion," she'd said, "with a different judge. They're arguing your medical crisis makes you unfit to care for a newborn and are requesting temporary custody be given to Margaret Ashford. Tori lay in her ICU bed, stunned, with drainage tubes in her abdomen, having nearly bled to death. And then the third catastrophe struck. Gregory Whitman was found beaten unconscious in a parking garage. His laptop with all the financial evidence stolen. It was a clear message from Derek. He might be under a protective order, but he still had people to do his dirty work. Tori was trapped, unable to walk, unable to even hold her child, while Gregory was in a coma, and a judge was considering taking her daughter away. Her father paced the hall, looking older than she'd ever seen him. Becca placed Charlotte's bassinet close, and Tori slipped her fingers through the bars to touch her daughter's tiny, impossibly strong hand. "I won," Tori whispered, "but it didn't matter. He'll never stop." "Then neither will we," Catherine had replied. She had woken up in the ICU 2 full days later, her body a landscape of pain that didn't feel like her own. The first thing she saw was the bassinet beside her bed. Inside, Charlotte was sleeping, perfect and just close enough to touch. Tori reached a trembling hand through the bassinet rails and felt Charlotte's tiny fingers curl around hers, so small, so real. But she couldn't lift her daughter. She was too weak, too tethered to drainage tubes, IV lines, and beeping monitors. For the first 48 hours of Charlotte's life, Tori could only know her through the bars of a hospital crib. She couldn't hold her, couldn't nurse her, couldn't do any of the things she dreamed of. This was the true price of Derek's violence, not money or status, but the stolen first moments between a mother and her child. The last thing she remembered before darkness took over was the sight of her father holding Charlotte, his face a mask of pure joy and absolute terror, tears streaming as he held his newborn granddaughter, while his own daughter was bleeding out on the operating table. The hemorrhaging was out of control. She had lost a dangerous amount of blood. Dr. Hoffman worked with frantic focus as calls went out for blood transfusions. More machines were wheeled in, more monitors, more people in scrubs, moving with a controlled, urgent rhythm. Charlotte was born at 4:22 in the morning, a tiny, pink, screaming miracle. We were blissfully unaware of the chaos she'd arrived in, but Tori was not okay. The blue couch was hers. The yellow kitchen chairs were hers. In the quiet of her own apartment, Tori watched her daughter Charlotte sleep peacefully in the real crib she'd bought with her own money. Every single thing in this small, safe space was hers, chosen and paid for by the life she was building from the ashes. This peace, this simple ownership, was the final victory, but it had been secured by a single, devastating move made months earlier. A digital ghost that had haunted a man who thought he was untouchable. Gregory's genius wasn't in fighting Derek, but in making sure Derek's own actions would be his undoing. Before the laptop was ever stolen, before James ever received that USB, everything was already safe. Every damning email, every wire transfer, every offshore account, all the proof of the $210 million Derek stole was backed up to an encrypted cloud. The password was his own daughter's birthday. Derek's men had seized the hardware, but they had completely missed the soul of the evidence. That evidence had been overwhelming. It took the jury less than a day to understand what had taken Derek 5 years to build. A criminal enterprise disguised as a corporation. The offshore accounts, once frozen, bled secrets. Bank statements, subpoenaed, told a story of lavish theft and falsified reports to shareholders. $210 million. In the courtroom, Derek Ashford was just a thief. Tori had already started her new life by then, taking a part-time position at the nonprofit she once ran, a place that welcomed her back the very day she applied. It was a slow start, but it was a start. She was a new mother, still recovering, still piecing her world back together from the ground up. But the real dismantling was happening elsewhere. The first emergency meeting of the board had been a failure, a 7-5 vote that kept Derek in power. He'd lobbied the 5 who stood by him, promising the investigation was nothing, that the stock would bounce back, that he was innocent. He had underestimated Diane Sullivan. She went to those same 5 board members, one by one, and quietly laid out their futures. She detailed their personal legal liability, how their own assets could be seized, how their names would be dragged through the mud for supporting a CEO under an active SEC investigation. She showed them the cliff they were about to walk off. The second vote was 10-2. Derek was terminated, escorted out of the company his own father had started. Employees watched silently as the man who screamed and threw laptops walked out for the last time. As Derek's empire crumbled, Tori's was being built. A promotion to director came with a modest paycheck, the first one she used to buy Charlotte's crib. In the months that followed, everything Derek owned was liquidated. The Manhattan penthouse, the Hamptons house, the Aspen vacation home, the yacht, the luxury cars, the $30 million art collection, all of it sold to repay what he'd stolen. Creditors and former partners descended with lawsuits. His own lawyers eventually dropped him for unpaid bills. He was left with a public defender for his criminal trial. While his world vanished, Tori found hers. She signed a lease on a small one-bedroom apartment. The view was a brick wall, not a skyline, but every piece of it was hers. And then another ghost from Derek's past appeared. Amber Collins called Tori, telling her a story that was terrifyingly familiar. Derek had started monitoring her phone, criticizing her friends, her life, saying, "Look what you made me do." But Amber had proof, financial records of every dollar he had spent on her through company accounts, expanding the SEC's case from massive to inescapable. The circle of women in the church basement listened as Tori spoke, her voice steady. "I was lucky," she said. "My father had resources to fight my abuser. Not everyone has that." They asked her what to do. "You save yourself," she told them, seeing her own fear in their eyes. "You take one tiny step. You tell one person. You save $1. You just take one step toward the door." She knew that door had always been unlocked, that she had been her own jailer, trapped by fear. That night, her phone rang. It was Margaret Ashford, Derek's mother. "Victoria, please don't hang up," she pleaded. The anonymous call about Derek's second account, that was me. Tori sank into a chair. "I couldn't stop him publicly," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "I was too afraid, but I could point you in the right direction." She confessed to a lifetime of abuse from Derek's father, how she had normalized the violence and taught her own son that it was a form of love. "I raised a monster," she cried. "I see that now." Tori didn't forgive her for the public humiliation, for calling her unstable on television, but in that moment she understood. Margaret was the ghost of her own future, what she would have become if she had stayed, a woman passing the disease of violence to the next generation. The visit was on a Tuesday, in a gray facility with humming fluorescent lights and cameras in every corner. A social worker sat near the door as Tori held 4-month-old Charlotte. Derek walked in, a ghost of the man he'd been. He was thin, his cheap suit hung off his frame, and dark circles were carved under his eyes. He looked 10 years older. The trial was over. He was already convicted. Tori had sat on the witness stand and calmly told the jury the whole truth, pointing to the fading scars on her throat, They had believed her. Derek's eyes locked on Charlotte. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice hoarse. "Can I hold her?" "No," Tori said. "Victoria, please, she's my daughter." "You tried to kill her?" Tori's voice was like ice. "When your hands were around my throat, you were killing both of us. You don't get to hold her." His jaw clenched with that familiar rage, but here he was powerless. "I'm sorry," he said. "I was under so much pressure. I wasn't myself." "Stop," Tori commanded, her voice firm. "You are yourself, Derek. The man who twisted my wrist, who isolated me from my friends, who tried to strangle me while I was pregnant with your daughter. That is who you are." He claimed he was sick, that he needed help. "You're not sick," she said. "You're abusive. There's a difference. Sick people take responsibility. You are making excuses. Even now, you didn't destroy my life. You destroyed your life." It all happened so fast. One moment there were beeps, the next the sounds were faster, more urgent, and the room was suddenly full of people. Within 30 seconds, Dr. Hoffman made the call. "We need an emergency C-section, now!" The world spun around Tori as hands lifted her to a gurney. She felt the operating room's chill, the adjustment of the epidural. She reached out blindly, her hand finding her father's. "Is the baby okay, Dad? Is the baby okay?" "The baby's fine," he promised, his voice tight. "You're going to be fine. I'm right here." And in that moment of terror, the long, painful, and ultimately triumphant fight for her daughter truly began. Model. The victory had been sealed on day 2 of the hearing, not by expert witnesses, but by Derek's own mother. On the stand, Margaret Ashford, the picture of dignified motherhood, described Tori as manipulative and difficult. But then Catherine played the video Margaret had shot on her phone at the gala. The shaky footage of her own son, Derek, with his hands wrapped around his pregnant wife's neck. "You recorded your son attempting to murder his wife," Catherine stated, her voice calm and lethal. "And you did nothing. You just kept filming." Margaret whispered, "I was in shock." Her composure shattered when Catherine suggested she was just gathering footage to use against Tori later. She had no answer. The need for that courtroom battle became terrifyingly clear just 2 days later, when a contraction took Tori's breath away. At the hospital, her labor progressed almost too quickly. At 9 centimeters, Dr. Hoffman's expression shifted. She spoke in hushed tones to the anesthesiologist, but Tori heard the words that sent a chill down her spine. The cervical bruising from the strangulation was causing complications. The attack that had nearly ended 2 lives was still threatening them. A final, cruel reminder of the man she had just escaped. Her father and her friend Becca held her hands, their presence a shield against the ghosts of the past. This was the truth she needed her daughter to understand, the truth she recorded in that quiet apartment. "Hi, baby girl," she began. "Your father was abusive because he made a choice to hurt people he claimed to love. That was his choice, not mine, not yours." She spoke of the years she spent making excuses, believing love was enough to fix him. "The moment I stopped asking for his permission to save myself was the moment I became free," she said, her voice steady. "Asking for help is strength. Your grandfather, Becca, Dr. Hoffman, Catherine, so many people helped me escape. I couldn't have done it alone." It all came down to one night. 3 days before the court hearing, 3 days before Charlotte was due, the air at the annual company gala was thick with false smiles and expensive perfume. Tori, 8 months pregnant, felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in her stomach as Derek's mood soured over a trivial comment. She saw his mother, Margaret, nearby, her phone already in her hand as if anticipating a moment worth capturing. Derek grabbed Tori's arm, his grip like steel, and pulled her into a deserted hallway. The look in his eyes wasn't just anger, it was something cold and final. And in that instant, Tori knew she wasn't just fighting for her own life anymore. That night, she threw up in the bathroom, her face pressed against the cool tile floor as her friend Becca held her hair. "I can't do this," she sobbed. But later, after everyone had gone to bed, a different thought took hold. It was a terrifying, dangerous idea, but it was hers. She picked up her phone, opened a recording app, and dialed his number. She decided that if she had to walk back into the fire, she would come out carrying the evidence that would burn him to the ground. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.